Shades of Grey, Chapter 2. Tony fucking Stark. Upon arriving through the doors, Loki noticed how big the place was in the room, or rather hall, and looked around at the busy stalls scattered around. There were people behind them handing out little packets for the students to collect. As he approached the stalls, which were set up in an alphabetical order, Loki wondered whether he should approach the O or the L table. Then he realized that, regardless of him finding out about his true parentage, he was still legally Loki Odinson, much to his disdain, and, with a grumble, made his way towards the O table. Odinson, he told the guy behind the table, trying to keep the disgust out of his voice. After a moment, the guy located 2 packets in his box. You Loki or Thor? The guy asked. Loki. Here you go. Loki took his pack from the guy's outstretched hand. He glanced at the front of the leaflet inside and saw the words, Welcome to your future, in bold at the front. This includes your dorm room number, class schedule, and student parking card, and other introductory items. There's a little key in a brown envelope for your dorm. The only other person who has one is your roommate, so you're safe, the guy informed him. What if I would like to exchange my roommate for another? Just maybe I don't know if I'm not compatible with the one you have paired me with, Loki asked. It never hurt to check what could be done if his roommate was a total psycho. Sorry, the university don't really allow room changes, what with the hassle and all. However, if you're really desperate and plead a good case, you can talk to the dean's assistant, the guy replied, noticing Loki's shoulders slumping a little and his expression falling. Wonderful, Loki murmured under his breath. I'm Phil, by the way. Phil Coulson. Welcome. The sandy blonde-haired student introduced himself with a warm smile. Loki nodded, forced a small smile to form on his lips and turned away, without a word. He looked around and found a little bench by the door and walked over to it, sitting down with a breath of relief and stretched his long legs out in front of him. He held his pack in one hand and took his dorm room information sheet in the other. Dorm Building 4, room 348. Upon seeing this, Loki feared that he would be put into a room with Thor. He couldn't bear the thought of being stuck in a small room with the oath for company. He would probably keep Loki awake all night, talking about how lucky he is that they were rooming together. He couldn't be stuck in a room with Thor. He just couldn't. Watching the annoying thought away from his mind, he looked up at the chaos before him and spotted a few too many eyes looking his way. He frowned and wondered what would cause so much attention. It was then that he noticed he was sitting beside the entrance door, and upon hearing the sound of an all too familiar voice belonging to the person standing in the doorway, Loki slowly lifted his eyes to glance at the man. What's up, Dracula? Tony Stark. Loki's eyes glazed over in anger and annoyance upon seeing him, and his fists clenched the pack in his hand. Stark, Loki spat. Hello, Tony would be nice, or maybe even a good morning. But I gather you're not that kind of person to be so civil, so I'll just settle with Stark, Tony mocked Loki's British accent with a wave of his hand. The younger man sneered. What are you doing here so early? I was under the impression you don't wake till midday, considering you're so bloody lazy. Why, I've come to see you, of course. My favorite person in the whole world. Shame you're not mine, Tony pouted. Now don't be so rude this early in the morning, dear. I might cry and tell Thor. Where's Goldilocks, by the way? Loki scoffed. Tell him your childish troubles all you want. I don't answer to him. Still got those brother issues, huh? Tony asked, stretching out his arms over his head. It's none of your business, Stark. Now leave me be. I've seen too much of your arrogant face already. Loki spat and turned to look at his phone for something to do. Tony smirked. You know, if you wanted to tell me that my face is pretty, you can just say so. No need to mask your attraction to me with harsh words, Loki. Loki looked up in horror. Tony's smirk grew. He knew just how to push Loki's buttons. Attracted to you? Please, Stark, don't make me laugh. I might just puke all over you, Loki told him, staring up at Tony and wishing he could just smack that smirk off his mouth. Oh, come now. Just admit you have the hots for me and I might just consider sleeping with you. Tony gave Loki a wink. Tony walked to stand in front of him and crossed his arms across his chest, watching Loki's expression of disgust and waiting for his reply. You are seriously delusional, Stark. And disgusting. Last chance. You might never get another one. You are the last person on this earth that I would even consider sleeping with. Even after Thor? Oh, isn't that incest? Kind of, Tony said, knowing Loki would get mad. And just as he expected, Loki's pale face turned red. In anger or embarrassment, Tony did not know, but it was enough to get him to snicker. This time, Loki stood up fully and towered over Tony. He was only 2 inches smaller, but with the way Loki was looking at him now, he seemed smaller. He didn't back away, though. He stood there smirking as Loki fixed him with a dark glare. You are seriously the most childish, most annoying, most goddamned insolent little... Loki started. Some students nearby turned to look at them both, to watch what was happening, but neither noticed, too caught up in the little argument that Tony was egging on. Careful, swearing is frowned upon in this establishment, Tony interrupted, waving his index finger at Loki like a child being told off. Loki cried in frustration. Get out of my face, or I swear to God, Stark, you'll what? Bore me to death with Shakespeare? Tony smiled mockingly, enjoying the way Loki's eyes glistened with rage. Good to know nothing's changed since high school. Do not mock me, Stark, or I'll... Brother! Tony! Both turned to look at the door and saw Thor coming in, followed by a very grumpy Bruce and a smiling Steve. What's up, Point Break? Tony ignored Loki and turned to Thor, who was beaming at them both, still not noticing Loki's stark expression. You're here, son of Stark. I did not expect you till this afternoon, Thor said, clapping him on the shoulder as was Thor's little habit of doing. Tony feigned shock. I'm hurt, Rapunzel. It's the first day, and you're already expecting the worst of me. Everyone expects the worst of you, Tony. Can't really blame them, can you? Steve interjected. Cap, you know it pains my heart to hear such words coming out of your mouth. Tony continued. Loki scoffed. I didn't know you had a heart. Tony pouted at Loki and caught Steve snickering behind Bruce's back. With that, Loki walked away in a troop, his morning quickly being dumped on by the only other person than Thor who could do such a great job of it. Brother, where are you heading? Thor shouted after him, about to follow when Steve put his hand on his shoulder and stopped him. Leave him, Thor, Steve said calmly. The blonde sent a glare towards Tony. Steve knew how much he liked to annoy Loki. In turn, Tony put his hands up as if to say, I'm innocent, but as always, he wasn't. Thor looked away from Loki's retreating figure and dropped his head in sadness. Steve wordlessly patted him on the shoulder as a form of comfort, then ushered them all towards the stalls, where nearby a horde of students were waiting, and all at once panicked in excitement when Tony Stark came by. Tony, an expert in all things related to fame and popularity, smirked. Bruce looked on disinterested, and Thor lagged behind, his head hung low. "This is going to be an eventful day, I just know it," Steve muttered to himself. Once Loki was away from the crowded room and away from any nearby groups of students, he growled loudly to himself and crumpled the sheet in his hand, forgetting for a second what it was. After a moment, he breathed deeply and washed all thoughts of Tony Stark from his mind. He wouldn't ruin this day for Loki, or the next hundreds of days to come during his studies, for that matter. He just wanted to be away from them all, from anything that reminded him of his high school years under Tony's torture and being hidden in Thor's overly sized shadow. Regaining his earlier state of calm, he unfolded the wrinkled paper in his hand and made his way out of a nearby door to start searching for dorm building 4, room 348. It wasn't a very easy job at first. The buildings had no labels on them that were visible from afar, and they were all very old and looked similar. Except for the library, which had been apparently modernized and had a clear enough sign at the front saying library. Loki had a feeling this was going to become one of his favorite places around campus. Passing by the expectedly quiet building, he continued walking and glancing down at the map in his hand, trying to pinpoint exactly where the storm was and exactly where he was. Not being able to find just a single building seemed stupid, and Loki never liked feeling stupid. He looked around the area for one moment and considered just giving up and asking one of the students nearby to show him. "You lost, pretty boy?" Loki snapped to attention. He glanced around his shoulder to see who was talking to him, before turning fully to face a tall, long-haired blonde girl standing before him, arms crossed under her quite large chest, her blue eyes boring into his with her eyebrow raised in expectation of his reply. What?" Loki asked, caught off guard for a second. "Are you lost?" the girl repeated, pointing to the map in his hand. "No, most certainly I'm not." "Kinda looks like you are. You need help?" "No, I am not," he insisted. "I can take care of myself, thank you." Loki curtly replied, then turned to walk away. She followed. "I've watched you for a few minutes now. You've been wandering around like a lost puppy, and now I've decided to take pity on you," the girl said, smiling up at him. Loki looked down at her, eyebrow raised and a sneer forming on his face. "Thank you for your offer, but I think I can find my way around, and I wasn't wandering like a lost puppy. I was merely exploring the campus," he lied, walking faster to leave her behind. But she matched his pace. Great, another annoying person he had to be faced with this early in the morning. After that little tension in the car between his family and that small scuffle with Tony, his morning was turning sour. His patience was running too thin already, and he really was not in the mood to talk to anyone, because he tended to snap and lose his temper more than he usually did. She ignored his rude tone and introduced herself. I'm Amora, by the way." "I did not ask." "I'm telling you anyway." No reply. "You're Loki, right?" "How did you—" "It's on your student pack." Loki placed the folder under his arm away from her sight, and she sighed. "Are you always this cranky, or is it just because it's your first day?" "I wish to be left alone, so I'm begging you, leave." "Ask me nicely." Loki huffed. Please go away, Amora scoffed. Look, you can either wander around here for another hour or so, or you can just tell me what building you're looking for. This place is pretty big, believe me. If I agree to your request, will you leave me alone afterwards? I can't promise anything, but I'll try. Loki made a noise and finally gave up, handing her the dorm information sheet, and she made a noise of delight. She looked at the sheet and Loki crossed his arms as she read over it. Monroe Building, that's building 4. Great, you're with me. I'm in room 345. Amora squealed in delight, unconsciously squeezing his arm a little too hard and made him flinch away from her. Sorry, I get a little too excited sometimes. Yes, I can see, Loki replied, rubbing his arm and taking back his sheet of paper. Amora smirked and nudged him. Now, didn't I tell you that I could help? And to think you were being so stuck up at first, Loki growled. I am not stuck up, thank you very much. Now, if you would so kindly take me to this building, we can go our separate ways afterwards and never speak to each other again. Fine, if you want to be that way. Amora pouted and then started walking, leading the way to dorm building 4. As they made their way slowly towards the destination, Loki found himself becoming more interested in Amora by the second as she kept going on and on about her passion for books, the arts, and about her family life. Specifically, the fact mentioned about her unknown parentage, which seemed to drag Loki in even more. He admitted he shouldn't have been so rude towards her at the beginning. So you do not know your real parents' identity? Loki questioned. Amora nodded and shrugged. Yeah, but who needs them? I have my sister Lorelei, and she's all I need to worry about. Especially because she gets herself into all sorts of trouble. I can't even count how many times. Loki sighed. I too have a sibling. My brother. Although we are not of blood, I admit that I did love him like my true family before. Before what? Before I found out that I was adopted and that he was not truly my relation, nor my mother and my father. Amora frowned. You know, just because he's not your real brother doesn't mean you have to stop loving him. It is a quite complicated and long story. I do not wish to speak of it at the moment. That's all right. I've actually been wondering how we got to the topic of family anyway. 10 minutes ago you found me annoying, Amora laughed. Loki shrugged. Yes, well, that was before. I do find you quite interesting now. Amora laughed even more at his honesty. I get the feeling that doesn't happen a lot. I'm honored. You should be, Loki said, and received a small smack on his arm from the blonde. Loki had to admit that this morning was turning out better than before. Maybe he didn't have to worry about anything, since he had made a friend in Amora, and what's better was that he could relate to her through their family issues. What she had said was true. He didn't have a lot of people he knew that were interesting enough to hang out with for more than a few hours or minutes even, because no one else could match his intellect or could talk about the things he enjoyed and loved. Now here was Amora, only knowing her for a few minutes, and he had already told her a significant part of his life. A part of him regretted telling her so quickly, but she seemed nice enough, and seemed to know of his pain. So here we are, the Monroe Building. Big, isn't it? It's the biggest dorm building out of all of them. They stopped in front of a white, semi-refurbished classical 10-story building, the slowly decoloring limestone giving it a traditional look. There were black-framed windows and a glass-walled ground floor, surrounded by 3 other connecting buildings of the same appearance. Amora pointed at a gold plaque by the side of the wall that said Monroe Building, South Dorm Room Building 4. What an inconveniently small labeled building. The name's actually in big writing on the other side of the building, facing the main road, so it's easier to spot. but not ideal for new students such as yourself, Amora giggled. It had a big green space in the middle at the front of the building and a few benches scattered around. There were a few students hanging around the outside, which gave it more of a homey feel. It was situated all the way across campus from the main building. No wonder he couldn't find it. So, 310 to 320 is on the first floor, 21 to 30 is on the second, and so on. Ground floor is where the laundry room and the rec room is, and there's a big TV in the living room. But people usually only watch football on there, so don't bother. Loki looked up and didn't know what to think. It all seemed pretty exciting, but the thought of sharing living quarters for the next year with a stranger who he didn't know, if he would like, was kind of scary, and he panicked a bit inside. He nodded at Amora and she led him inside, saying hello to a few people passing by. "You need help unpacking? I already unpacked my stuff yesterday, so I have nothing else to do." Amara led him inside the elevator with his suitcase and pressed the third floor button. "No, I think I'll be fine." "All right, just call me if you do." "Is it always this noisy?" Amara shrugged. "Yeah, people can get pretty crazy during the first weeks when they're trying to settle in." Loki huffed. "Great. Don't worry. I'm kind of a big influence around here ever since last year, so I can tell everyone to shut up if you want some peace and quiet." Amara smirked and leaned against the elevator wall. "What occurred last year?" Loki turned towards her in interest. "Let's just say there was a big party and someone flashed her chest to all the guys in the dorm." Amora blushed a little, but she still smirked, looking proud. Loki raised an eyebrow. "Classy. Very classy." Amora half smiled. "Yeah, well, you gotta use your assets, right? If you want to have an easier life here, don't you? Not that I'm trying to say women should be used like that. It's just the way I like to do things." Loki just snorted as the elevator came to a stop and the doors opened. They both stepped out, and Amora pointed to the left of the corridor. "Staircase is at the end of the hall, and the odd rooms are on the left and events are on the right." Loki turned his gaze away from the stairs and looked to the right, to see a couple of people standing by the end of the corridor. He stiffened. Thor stood with Steve, Bruce, and Clint outside of a dorm room, gathered around the open front door as they chatted animatedly. Before Loki could attempt to hide or get back into the elevator, Thor spotted his brother and called out to him, "Brother, over here!" Thor waved his hands and all of them turned to see Loki standing there with Amora by his side, leaning against the wall, surveying all of them with keen interest. "Ah, so that's your brother?" she asked Loki. "He's a quite eager guy, isn't he?" Loki sighed. "Yes, unfortunately. He's not very discreet. He doesn't know the meaning of peace and quiet." Amora nudged him to go on, and she continued walking towards the end of the hall, Loki following begrudgingly behind. As they approached, Steve, Bruce, and Clint all greeted Loki, and the younger man nodded at them in acknowledgement. Thor smiled at his brother. "Who is this?" Thor pointed at Amora, who only continued looking at them all. Loki sighed at his brother's manners, or lack thereof, and gazed at Amora. She introduced herself and shook all their hands, liking that she was being surrounded by a couple of handsome men. "Pleasure to meet you," Steve said politely, oblivious to the way Amora was looking him up and down. "I'm Steve. This is Bruce, Clint, and that's Thor." "Pleasure to meet you all," she turned to Thor. "I've heard so much about you. Thor, isn't it? Loki's told me quite a few, interesting things." Steve and Bruce raised their eyebrows, while Clint only suppressed his laugh when Thor, who was only too happy to hear that Loki had been talking about him to a stranger, beamed and nodded at her. Glad to hear that my brother speaks so highly of me, Thor grinned. Loki rolled his eyes. Don't get used to it. He spared a glance at his open door, looking at the plaque on the front, which said 348. Brother, are you in the storm building as well? Thor asked, looking at his sheet in his hand. Yes, unfortunately I am. It just so happens that all of you are loitering outside my new dorm room, Loki snapped. As Loki said that, all of them, except for Amora, looked at Loki with wide eyes. He frowned, and Amora just looked at all of them in turn, confused. What have I done now? Loki asked, looking at all of them. Steve coughed, clearing his throat while Bruce tried to grab the door handle and close it. Thor only looked down at his feet, and Clint again was trying to suppress a laugh that Loki knew would soon burst out of him anyway. Amora peeked a little inside of the half-closed doorway and saw someone coming out of the bathroom inside. Oh, look, your roommate's already here, Amora pointed to the door, and Loki frowned. Steve, Bruce, and Clint all backed away from the door upon hearing the toilet flush, and Thor attempted to stop Loki from going in, but thought better of it. What's going? Loki said, but stopped dead in his tracks when he pushed the door open, and there stood his roommate in the middle of the room, toothbrush in hand and a condom in the other. Oh, look who's back! Tony fucking Stark.